This video will cover the balance of intensity and duration so that you know whether or not your cold training practice is optimized. There are many burnt out, overstressed people, and I don't want you to be one of them. My name is Matt Soule, and I want to show you how you can learn to leverage the key pathways of stress that will propel you towards your best life. The two primary factors for intentional cold stress exposure are 1, duration, and 2, intensity, in this case, the temperature. As a guiding principle for health, strength, and resilience, the colder the exposure, the less time you should be in the cold. This is true not just for surviving, but for thriving. You may or may not know, but temperatures of less than 64 degrees Fahrenheit are needed to trigger non-shivering, cold-induced thermogenesis. So assuming your water is below that temperature, it's just a matter of optimizing duration, frequency, and recovery, right? Well, not quite. If you've watched my other video on optimizing cold water immersion for strength gains and recovery, you know that lower temperatures often produce better results. So get your temperatures down under 45 degrees, at least for part of your training each week. Now, how often do you need to do that? Well, here is where the art kind of comes in. There are 3 simple rules to determine the proper combination of duration and intensity, referred to as a dose. Because timelines shift from day to day due to cumulative stress demands, the following 3 rules can be a great guide to keep you moving in the right direction. These are what I refer to as cold training indicators. Number 1, how long can you remain focused? Before you get into a cold immersion, be aware of your present state. Did you get a good night's sleep? Have you eaten recently? What's your emotional, psychological, and physical challenges that you're dealing with? There's no need to harp on these things. Just be aware that they all contribute. A day when you are dealing with an inordinate amount of stress is likely not the best time to push yourself extra hard, to stay for extended training, or attempt some kind of personal record in the cold. The vast majority of days, we just simply want to show up to the cold with an open mind and pay attention. You can know how long to stay simply by how long you can remain focused. So rather than guessing in advance or setting yourself up to meet a predetermined time, learn to just pay attention and listen to your body. Doing so can also help you avoid the pitfall of trying to force an exposure through sheer will. That's often a good way to experience setbacks or get injured. There's a time for pushing limits, don't get me wrong, but it should be reserved for infrequent, very intentional occasions. Another thing to be aware of with regard to focus is experiencing strong perceptual changes while in the cold water. I've had the opportunity to see how even highly conditioned practitioners can experience perceptual changes in a relatively short time. It can happen pretty quick after entering the cold, and it can sneak up on people. Cold training shows up different each day. I need to hit that point home. So here's the thing. Many people report that once they've been in the cold plunge for about 5 minutes, they feel like they could stay in there forever, or rather, like for an unknown extended period. They feel no pressure to get out of the cold stress. However, many also report that around 7 to 10 minutes, their vision begins to change, becoming glassy or slightly blurry. That's their body letting them know that they should get out of the plunge, but it's the only indicator. They don't feel bad or often even cold. I'll give you a quick story. One of my students, a long-term cold practitioner, told me he'd once stayed in the plunge for 13 to 15 minutes. Now, this is a substantial time. He was unsure about the exact time because when he looked at the clock, he found that while he could make out the hands, he didn't quite know what they meant. By all other accounts, he felt great, but he figured he should get out. It was definitely the right call. I know that story is anecdotal, but I feel the information is worth noting for a few reasons. 1 is the fact that the same numbers keep coming up. For example, the fact that once people pass a 5-minute mark, they feel no pressure to get out of the cold. The other that is more and more frequent is that people around the world are gathering in groups to do cold exposures in freezing temperatures for more than 5 minutes, or even solo for more than 5 minutes. Now, while I'm clearly an advocate for the practice, many of these people are unconditioned or only moderately conditioned to the cold, and are therefore unaware that the cold exposure itself is only half the exercise. You still have to warm up and recover. Furthermore, when in a group of people, especially one that you're all having fun, it's easy to lose focus and awareness and suffer negative consequences as a result. So remember, the goals of the practice are to build up your strength, gain the mirrored benefits for your health, and become more resilient and more connected. Breaking the body down too far by staying in the cold too long, this is not going to result in those gains. For these reasons, start with how long you can remain focused in the cold. And remember that you must recover from that cold exposure. To use an appropriate metaphor, to undergo the cold exposure is only the climb up the mountain. You still must descend safely. All right, 2. How fast can you recover? As you're learning, growing, and challenging yourself to optimize this practice, you should use your recovery to guide you. This does not mean that you take days off because you just don't feel like it. No, it means that you really pay attention to the signs and signals your body is actually giving you. For those that are new to the cold training practice, a cold exposure in freezing temperatures often results in everything from numb hands and feet. Sometimes they remain like that for as long as an hour after emerging. Now, in rare cases, it may last a little bit longer, but these effects subside with practice and safe exposures over time. All practitioners should use recovery time as an indicator of both safety and progress. So a good goal for full recovery is about 10 to 15 minutes, and that's without an exogenous heat source. In other words, no showers, no sauna, and you should be able to do that without an adverse after drop experience, a topic I cover in detail later on in another video. If you're new to the cold exposure, I'd recommend starting with a maximum of a 2-minute exposure, assuming that the water is at or below 45. Such an exposure is challenging enough and will give you great benefits. As you get comfortable with that and you begin to recover faster, you can safely move to the next step, which is increasing reps, not time. So rather than extending exposure times, which becomes easier to do, but not necessarily easier to recover from, it is far better to limit the times and increase the reps. In other words, continue using 2-minute cold exposures, but do more of them in a single session. Between each rep of, let's say, 2 minutes, warm up with light activity and keep your mind focused. This approach is far more informative of your body's ability to handle more cold than is a single longer session. It also allows you to check in frequently. If you're able to do, let's say, 3 sets of 2 minutes and feel good, well, you can very likely do 6 minutes in a single session and feel good, right? Using that 2-minute rep mark will build you up much faster to doing extended time safely. It's also a useful mental hurdle in training yourself to meet stress over and over while shifting your perception and overcoming the presented challenges. All right, number 3, how do you feel throughout the hours and days following the exposure? The minutes, hours, and days following a cold exposure provide good measure of whether you are receiving optimal benefits. Remember, stress put on the body that acts as a catalyst for positive changes is hormetic stress. Stress that breaks the body down and leaves it vulnerable is chronic and leads to illness and injury. Don't forget that cold is a stress. Think about wind and how it acts upon a tree. Right? Wind is a stressor for a tree. In order for a tree to develop strong roots, it needs to have some wind. But too much wind, such as a hurricane or a tornado, no longer provides beneficial stress. It simply rips the tree from the ground. We can make an argument that the few trees that survive such storms maybe benefit from having gone through so much stress intact. While this may be true, such trees are few and far between, and there are certainly other factors in play besides the strength of a tree. In that case, the big storm still lets up. Individuals, like trees, have different capacities to handle total stress at different times. When I first began to subject myself to the cold, I was very unconditioned and struggled a lot. Just a small amount of cold stress was a substantial challenge in a given day. Considering how many other stressors I had in my life at that time, it would not have been useful to pile on large quantities of cold stress. Instead, taking a gradual and consistent approach allowed me to soar. Now, having taught thousands of students, I recognize how similar my experience was to those of so many others. And in contrast, I easily understand why so many have struggled in their attempt to build this practice, and why they start off strong only to stop a short time later, confused because they got sick or injured. When you remain in cold water for a reasonable length of time, a beneficial stress response ensues. When you get out of the cold, you should feel energized, elated, because large amounts of hormones and neurotransmitters are driving this chemical joy train. But if you get out and feel a deep ache and a disorienting chill, you've gone too far. Now, both responses can range in intensity, so pay attention to the first feeling. It is your initial indicator to determine the appropriate dose of the cold. The next indicator is how you feel between 1 and, let's say, 4 hours later. Do you still feel energized? If so, excellent. You did the right amount. If you feel tired, cold, or worse yet, exhausted with an aching chill that won't go away, you definitely used too long of an exposure and need extra recovery time. Now look, mistakes will happen. Just take a warm shower and rest. Next time, back off, do a little bit less. The exception to those guidelines is when you intentionally set out to do an intense cold exposure and push yourself to your limits. When you do this, just make sure you give yourself plenty of rest and recovery time afterward. And always be mindful of your safety, because body temperature is a gradient. and not easily turned around just because you get out of the cold. It can take an exorbitant amount of energy to warm up if you take it too far, and that presents other risks such as heart attack, all kinds of downstream huge problems, so don't go there. Finally, the last indicator for this section is how you feel the next day. Did you wake up ready to tackle the day after a great night of sleep and recovery? I mean, you crushed it. Your cold training is serving you as intended and you're approaching optimal. If on the other hand you have a residual fatigue, maybe you've got a cold training injury such as frostbite, numb toes or fingers, or God forbid wake up sick, you did too much. Get plenty of rest and recovery. As it may be difficult to come back from this kind of setback, you might struggle to resume your practice. However, if you recognize it as a mistake, you can pick yourself up again and begin. Except this time, you'll be much more aware. Use the experience as the extremely important lesson that it is. If you like this video and you want more content, please hit that like button and subscribe. Until next time, stay chill.